Thanks so much for joining me for another episode of Chris Endrey podcast. I want to say sorry that we're coming out a little bit late this week. Unfortunately, I've been in a household with sick kids, and if you have that in your own life, you know what a handful it can be, and I've been sick myself. But all good now, and glad to be with you to have the opportunity to talk this out because, as I'm sure you've seen from the episode title, I'm going to talk a bit about the Charlie Kirk assassination and the response to that and what it all means. I don't come into this with an expert perspective. In fact, I'd never heard of Charlie Kirk until this week. And also going into it, I'm not exactly sure what I think about what I've seen, but it's clear from the way in which our society, ours being Australian, but also obviously US society, and I guess just global commentariat society has responded to this, points to it being about much more than the death of one person. And I think that the way in which we have these interactions and process them socially these days is distinct and worth exploring. And I guess I just hope to, with you, work a little bit more at understanding exactly what it is that's happening, because it's all well and good to say that this is just one event, or it's all well and good to say that society's falling apart and we're all drifting towards fascism or far left extremist violence or whatever it is. But obviously reality is a little more complex than that, and the wheels that drive social change are a little more subtle. But I think it's fair to say that there's a feeling in the air following this murder that has opened up a bit of more of a rift in the discourse than the murder of any of the other journalists in recent times. I should say there have been a lot of journalists murdered even since Charlie Kirk was killed. The strike by Israel in Yemen taking out, I think, 24 yesterday. But, life's not fair and all things are not equal. And so there's something happening here, and we're going to explore and see what it is. And hopefully by reflecting on all the sort of side topics that this echoes into, we can have some useful understanding of what it is that's occurring here. So if you have strongly held views on the matter, you're free to have them, but you might want to hold them a little lightly for the next 30 minutes, because if everything I've seen on social media is anything to go by, my perspective on this is unique and I hope worth at least considering. Let's get into it. So it's been a few days now since conservative activist and media personality Charlie Kirk was murdered while speaking at an event of his on campus in Utah. And unsurprisingly, it's echoed through the rifts of the fractured political landscape in the US, but also across the world. Because as nice as it is to theorize and to say, well, every life is equal and so we should treat every death as equal, it's unfortunately not the case, because some people are just more in the spotlight than others, and some people represent positions more than others. But it's not surprising. I mean, I don't know how many people die on the roads in Britain every year, but, Princess Di, despite not being known personally to most people, it was going to be a more significant road death than any other in that year, or perhaps everyone since. And similarly, when someone inhabits the space that I've only subsequently learned Charlie Kirk did inhabit, they represent more than just the sum of their own life and the people that they have connections to, which appears in his case to be vast anyway. I see he's an advisor of President Trump and that he goes around speaking to many people. But also he represents a particular political paradigm in that place, and at a time where all the evidence is what has historically been shared terrain between people who vote for the right and left parties in America is shrinking and the polarization is increasing. So, of course, firstly, when anybody gets killed like this, the question is who did it and why? And there was some early speculation with a report from the Wall Street Journal that there were words found on discarded bullet casings that indicated it was a trans ideological motivation. That was quickly retracted, and it subsequently seems to have come out. Again, impossible to know for sure for me, but that there's some combination of various Reddit subcultures and Antifa messaging. I mean, regardless of whatever the specifics are, the thing that I want to talk about is how we respond to it. And maybe the first thing I want to say is just it's so shocking to me each time these things happen, how the weight of these things sits on Australians. You would think that at most it would be a distant curiosity, or there would be sympathies or whatever. But if my social media feed's anything to go by, and my feeds are pretty broad in terms of the people that I'm friends with and the people that I follow, it's reverberated more than any other news that I've seen, including all the things that have happened within Australia this year, which is so strange. And I think harkens back to that cultural colonization where we really don't seem to have space for our own discourse relative to the weight that we give to US cultural discourse. It's crazy because, what it means to be he was 31, a 31-year-old Christian conservative in that society is a totally different thing to what that would mean within Australia. But I can't even think of who an equivalent figure would be in Australia. In fairness, I don't follow these things, so I didn't even know who he was, as I said. Nor have I heard of his channel Turning Point, but fair to say it's a wash on everyone's feeds now with the huge signal boost that this stuff gets. So firstly, there's just my surprise, and I really shouldn't be surprised by now, but it is still very surprising to me that this stuff is given such a big cultural weight. But secondly, that cultural weight has attached to it the need that people have to express an opinion. And I guess I've seen opinions expressed on this across the full spectrum of politics and humanity, where people are genuinely mourning and sad, or they're intellectually concerned that this type of thing happens, all the way to the other end where they go from being sort of pithy or defensively not caring to outright celebrating. And again, just as much as the fact that this has a cultural weight in Australia and Europe shouldn't be surprising to me by now, the same is true, and perhaps is a bit more true, with the types of reactions that people have to this stuff. It shouldn't be surprising to me to see people cheering on the cold-blooded murder of somebody who I'm just going to go on the record and say I don't think should have been murdered. And not just because their opinions were okay. Like, I have seen very few of them. I think I agree with basically none of them. And I think it's tragic that this stuff happens. And I think if you're one of the people that thinks that these people should be murdered for agitating for an opinion in public, I think that you'll find that you just can't build a society from those rules, because whoever you are on the planet, you hold opinions that somebody else will think are completely wrong and heretical. And there will be extremist members of that cohort, of that type of person who thinks that whatever you think is heretical, who will think, oh, well, it's kind of reasonable if somebody should kill you, or kill somebody who thinks whatever it is that you happen to think. And like, when you apply that to literally everybody, I mean, you see that happen once revolutions start, actually, I should say, that there comes this increasing clamoring for moral purity, and it happened in the French and the Russian revolutions, and I'm sure is common to lots of societies. But once you start to open the gate on the idea of, oh, well, it's okay to kill somebody because their opinions are violence, or their opinion is what's ruining society, the aperture sort of gradually widens until you're justified killing everybody, until whatever energy is behind that inevitably burns out and collapses. And I think the fact that there is such an abundance of people celebrating murders like this, it feels like a very online phenomenon, or it's a very distanced one. I don't think that most of the people who are advocating for that stuff would be doing it in person to somebody who was sympathetic with the views of the deceased, let alone to people who personally knew them. I don't think the people that I know that are celebrating would be as callous as that, at least I hope. Maybe this sort of entitlement to have a need to have a reaction is just a reaction that you project to other people about such things. You know, even just the defensive one to say, well, I don't care about this because I care about something else. This isn't important to me. Like, you don't need to say that. Like, there's any number of things that people do and don't care about that they don't go around constantly reflexively making statements upon online. And so I guess there's just sort of the group identifiers and that sort of hyper acceleration of that general trend that we see with the existence of the internet at all being meted out here in a small period of time and across a large group of people. So it seems maybe even more nuts than usual. But in this instance, it seems to be starker than usual because, I guess, firstly, because from what I can see, Charlie Kirk doesn't seem to be a particular outlier in his perspectives. I'm sure the things that he is broadly agitating are shared by minimum tens of millions of Americans. And obviously you can't kill that many people just for disagreeing with them. Secondly, this murder comes in the context of a fractured America where America is a much more violent society than any other society I've ever lived in. It's not the most violent society in the world, but certainly compared to other Western societies, it's quite shocking how high the prevalence of gun ownership and gun crime is. And even just the general divergence of perspectives that people hold. I mean, it's the gift and the curse of America, right? You can find one of everything there, and somehow they manage to keep this polity together seemingly just quite often, but they keep this whole polity together. We have millions of people on the extreme right and the extreme left in the ways that you don't even find large cohorts of in other Western countries. And they manage to keep it all together. But once people start killing each other over their ideas, it threatens to be a far more volatile problem because, I mean, they've got 400 million guns or whatever it is, and nobody's changing that wicked problem in a hurry. And if the toxic debates grow in extremism, it's hard to see how that ends well for people, whether it be the fracturing of day-to-day life or the structural fracturing of how they set up their society. And it feels like an overreaction to say that that stuff is what's going to happen now. But it's not impossible. It's happened before in any number of societies, but it's also happened before in the US. They've changed radically, and a lot of their radical changes have occurred alongside assassinations. And I tend to think that it's an indication of momentous movements under the surface of the society that sort of pop up and are expressed through tragedies like political assassinations and similar one-off phenomena, rather than it's the political assassinations themselves that trigger the movements. I mean, it would be a dynamic. Do we end up with the civil rights movement in the 60s ending up where it did without the assassination of Martin Luther King, or is it the case that the progress of that movement led to the assassination of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X? It's hard to say, but as much as those examples and many others indicate that there's a history of violence in American politics, there have been a few murders in the last couple of years that I think indicate the echoes of larger social change movements. And I'm not suggesting social change is in the inevitable positive progression to things that are really great, but just that things are dynamic and shifting. I mean, just to think of Luigi Mangione, that was another one. He murdered the CEO of the health company, and people still celebrate that, which is indicative of an underexpressed dissatisfaction with the US medical system, and a hard one to resolve at the ballot box. But similarly, of course, the murder of George Floyd triggered the Black Lives Matter movement and worldwide protests. I mean, I see on one of my walks from a bus stop, I see an of the time Black Lives Matter sticker just in the middle of the forest, which is really something in a country that must be 98% plus white. And at least by the conventional narrative, Donald Trump was seemingly just an inch or two away from being killed himself. Regardless of what you think of Donald Trump, it's hard to see how him being murdered in that context would be a stabilizing and uniting factor for America. And that general sense that there's an increase in the conditions for social collapse or social calamities, it's not just a feeling that many of us have, because people obviously have that feeling all the time. There is a science, it's controversial for obvious reasons, but there's a series of mathematical historians that generate predictive models by looking back through history, seeing what the patterns are in certain periods and identifying them and using then that to construct models that they use to generate predictions for the future. And one that gained a lot of attention is a very intelligent mathematician, Peter Turchin, who in the middle of the first Obama term predicted that there would be a rise in political instability in the US across the 2010s. This is while Donald Trump was still a TV host. He predicts that there will be significant social disruption starting around 2020 and peaking across the mid-2020s with an increase in violence and assassinations. And this has absolutely been borne out. We're at a period in the US where the rate of assassinations is the highest that it's been. It's higher now than it was in the 1960s, which is really something. And it's the highest that it's been since the 1860s, which is, of course, the period up to the US Civil War. For obvious reasons, it's very hard to take things from the past and use them to predict the future because the future is not known and there's any number of outlier things that could occur to make your predictions completely wrong, and there's too many variables to really know what's happening. Things don't really happen in cycles perfectly. The model that he's constructed is something not that he's run just over the US, but he's run over all sorts of global societies. There are a few reasons that he predicts the increase in this instability. To dig into it, his theory specifically points to stagnating wages, a growing wealth gap, a surplus of educated elites without corresponding elite jobs, and an accelerating fiscal deficit. And he identifies correctly that nearly every one of those indicators has intensified in recent times and is likely to intensify further in the next little period as we see wage stagnation, the effects of AI start to kick in on the professional class, and public finances that are becoming increasingly unmanageable due to the large borrowing and the handcuffing that huge rates of debt to GDP put upon states' capacity to address stuff. Interestingly, he attributes these spikes in the US violence to 50-year cycles, which he links to how generations tend to forget what came before. So I've got to quote him here. After 2 generations, memories of upheaval fade, elites begin to reorganize systems in their favor, and the stress returns. And I think that that's something that we're seeing. Perhaps one obvious difference from the past for mine is that there are a lot more distracting cultural phenomena today where people maybe instead feel a general dis-ease about their financial distress or disenfranchisement from status or whatever it might be. And rather than easily attributing it to the incumbent political class, it's maybe easier to identify sort of feelings-based enemies. But I mean, maybe that's always been the case. It's impossible to know. Regardless, it's interesting to note that this dynamic was not predicted in 2016 when everybody predicted the end of the world with Donald Trump being elected, but this was predicted well before that, just by looking at the structural drivers. So again, that's popular immiseration, elite overproduction, and a weakening state capacity. Obviously, there's a survivorship bias where people make predictions all the time, and the people who make outlier predictions that are correct, you look back and see that they're super smart or whatever. But I really think that there is something to this because his predictions have been outlier and only increasingly true as time's gone on. So that doesn't determine where things go from here, but he's not the only person that talks about how in the West, but in the US in particular, there's been the risk of creating a radicalized knowledge class where you've got overeducated, underemployed, and institutionally excluded people who feel disenfranchised. And some small percentage of outlier individuals will turn to radical violence to express that. And this is also borne out in a general increase in terrorist type attacks. It's hard to disaggregate because there's so much gun crime and violence anyway in the US compared to other societies, but there has still been an increase in violence for violence sake and terror attacks through the 2020s. And this isn't just visible in its outlier form of extreme violence or terror attacks, assassinations, etc. That phenomenon of having ambitious but frustrated people who then grow disillusioned and radicalized, the consequence of that is that they seek to undermine institutions rather than join them and integrate them, especially if they can't integrate and join them. They then turn to undermine them. And I think that's a cultural phenomenon that you see across all sides of society where the incumbent systems of power, whether they are government, media, cultural authorities, or even historical orthodoxy or traditional cultural leadership, whatever it is, when people feel ambitious and capable, but they are excluded from having any sort of skin in the game in those realms, they very quickly turn to undermine them. And I think that you see that in the disrespect, in many instances, completely deserved, that all of those institutions are receiving in current times compared to in previous generations where they were sort of pillars of society that people bought into. Of course, what are the specifics of the manifestations of this? Impossible to guess, but as those of us who have read Black Swan will know, the risk of huge outlier events occurring is always larger than it seems. And we know that historically things like civil war and revolution and whatever, those things do happen. They've happened to our grandparents, they've happened to our neighbors, and it's very easy to assume that they won't happen to us and that whatever present reality we're in is some sort of normal baseline to predict the future, but it's chaos and impossible to know. Which is not to suggest that we are all just victims to this stuff and don't have our own voice and voting with our feet in how the future is created. It's something we all do together. And I think a big part of easing the worst of this stuff is not buying into the instinctive anger, us versus them, and celebrating violence that always accompanies the increase of the rate of descent into the worst depravities of human harm that we've seen historically. So then what are the likely consequences of this? It's impossible to say. Even speculating, I'm not sure how useful it is, only to say that there will be some unintended outcomes. Will there be copycat type of situations? Will there be reprisal types of attacks? Hopefully no to both, not impossible. But what I think is an inevitable outcome is that there's an increased degree of mistrust across party lines. There's certainly something that those who are attached to Charlie Kirk and his work can hold up and legitimately say, this is an outrageous thing that's happened to our guy, and all these things that I think apparently are dangerous to somebody, so dangerous that they're willing to kill for, which I think sort of will reify those ideas for the people that were fans already. And I hope it doesn't stop people from doing what he did, which was going around and talking to people and having public arguments, as tedious as the ones that I've seen seem to be. I do, at least in principle, think that type of exchange is exactly what you want to have a well-functioning democracy. And is also something that you really need to have at this time where there is that increasing fractiousness. But yes, we're kind of getting the worst of both worlds here, where not only do we have some good evidence for it not being a great idea to go out in public and to argue with people upon political matters, but also we have this hyper adrenaline shot to the heart where everybody needs to give their opinion online and contest those. I mean, I've seen a lot of people with really aggressive responses. I've seen people post mild things and receive threats. I've seen people post things that are even critical that are then criticized as being not critical enough, and also just small things like people putting up sympathetic things saying no one should die for their opinion. Receive a deluge of unfriendings or whatever else, whatever social violence people can find to give to each other online. It's all pretty tedious as per usual, but as I said, it's that shot, adrenaline shot to the heart that indicates that there's something more that's going on here. And it's hard to identify the gravity of those. Is it just that we're a lot more online? Is it that this guy's so popular in a way that I've completely missed? Or is it that we feel disenfranchised by the discourse or disenfranchised in our own lives? I think that's probably one of the likely culprits. I talk a lot in this podcast about how democracy is pretty cosmetic and we don't have it in most of the spheres that are most important to us. And there are many areas of modern life that have made life objectively worse for people that we don't seem to have any recourse to address or even understanding of. And, that's frustrating. And then when something happens that you disagree with online or that you agree with strongly online, then you need to go into bat for it. I mean, I experience these emotions and display this behavior, but fortunately I seem to channel it exclusively to being an idiot about my Geelong Cats and anybody criticizing them or suggesting that they win because it's unfair or whatever. I wade right in and I'm blinkers on. I'm like, everyone else is wrong and only I'm right, and people who agree with me are good and everyone who disagrees with me is bad. I'm lucky to have such a hyper stupid realm to exercise it in which, I don't need to agitate for the death of my enemies or whatever. But, I could see how quickly how exactly that same life energy of us, them is transferred into realms where there are life and death stakes and life and death motivators. Crazy. One thing I saw that I wanted to talk about a bit is that it generally feels like World War I out there, in that there's a whole bunch of precariously set pieces. There's a sense that things could collapse, and then, there are certain trigger events that can trigger things off. I kind of subscribe to that idea that there are a lot of precarious moving pieces that will have to change, and who knows how they're going to go. Everything could collapse, and there's a lot of dangerous things out there. A few years ago, got really into reading about World War I, kind of like it was an echoing gravity or something like that. I just had to know more because it was so sort of resonant to contemporary times. But one interesting thing I discovered from my readings about World War I is that whilst we teach what occurred as being understood, it really seems to me like we still don't understand what exactly happened or how it happened, which is incredible because it's, I think you could fairly say, the definitive point of the 20th century and the first domino to fall in every catastrophe that happened in the last 100 years. And so to think that we still don't understand it, even despite having very good records of the period and people around to talk to until very recently, is interesting. But one of the major things that we constantly learn is that it started with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo, whereas it seems that maybe is not the case. And I've been converted to believe that it's much less of a factor than it had been presented to me throughout my life. There's an American historian who teaches at one of their military academies, Michael Nyberg. He's excellent. You can even just find his lectures and listen to them. He puts some of them up for when he's touring the books that he's written. But he highlights, and I think saliently, that the assassination of the Archduke and his wife wasn't even the biggest news of its time. It sort of started off on the front page of the paper and quickly fell off and died down and was quite a background issue by the time the war itself actually started. It wasn't on people's minds. There were far larger things on people's minds, particularly in France, where there was another political scandal unfolding at the time. And so it seems to be only in retrospect that we attribute a clear causal line between the motorcade carrying Franz Ferdinand taking a wrong turn and Gavrilo Princip getting the fatal shots off and the destruction of 20 million young men in in what can only be considered an extremely futile war. So if it is the case that in 20 years we look back and say, oh, in 2025 US civil war started once with a spate of shootings of journalists or whatever it may be, I think it would be, firstly, let's hope that doesn't happen, but secondly, it's very easy and our natural instinct to attribute single outcomes with single causes, but it's basically never the case that those things are true. So you can rest easy about that, at least. This murder and all its consequences is another one of the examples of how lucky we are in Australia to have peaceful societies, and across Europe broadly to have pretty peaceful societies as well. Because I did some digging and I thought about, when is the last time an Australian journalist was assassinated? And there is actually an Australian journalist in China at the moment who received the death penalty, but and other than that, you really have to go back to the Balibo Five, who were Australian and New Zealand journalists murdered in East Timor when Indonesia occupied it in 1975. That's kind of the last time you have Australian journalists being murdered for their journalistic work. That's perhaps not exactly true, because cameraman Harry Burton was killed by the Taliban in 2001. But these incidents, they're not quite the same. They're not comparable to someone being assassinated for their opinions within our own society. And even political murders, I don't think there are any that have occurred in my lifetime. There was poor Don McKay, who was assassinated in the 70s, but that seems to be an organized crime thing rather than an ideological one. So I would have hoped that lack of first-hand engagement with violent consequences for political perspectives would be something that would be largely antithetical or anathemic to Australian culture, but it seems like, at least in our rhetoric, we love it. I think of us as people that have, the egg boy who egged Malcolm Roberts and the guy that threw the shoe at was it John Howard on Q&A? I think of that sort of stuff as the extent of political violence in Australia, and I hope it remains that way. I hope that all the rhetoric and social media outpouring and normalization of this stuff is just limited to these realms where we have our sort of first hindbrain reaction to stuff, and then it doesn't at all reflect how people behave in real life. But I'm sure if you're a listener of mine and you work for ASIO or whatever, and you want to get in touch and say, actually, we stop these things all the time, there are people who are really trying to do bad stuff, but we've just got big systems against them, get in touch. I would love to hear and share that perspective. But hopefully we can work to a world where that sort of peacefulness is endemic. And, maybe one of the unintended consequences in all of this will be that America will realize that nobody should be killed for their opinions, and we can all settle down and listen to each other and share ideas, and whatever crazier things have happened. I don't know if they have. Anyway, a bit of a heavier exploration. I don't really have too much to say, but I hope that listening to it has offered you something, and that we can all find the meditations that we need to work towards ongoingly finding compassion for the people that we like the least, because that really is the only way that we can keep the wide open tent with everybody in it and have all the good times that we deserve. Thanks for listening. Sorry again for being late this week, but we'll be back on regular schedule next week. Please take care wherever you are. And extra thanks, as always, to my Patreon patrons. I got a new one, Sean McLaughlin. Thank you for joining. Really appreciate you. And I hope that wherever you are, you have a rewarding journey, not just in your own life, but more importantly, listening to Chris Endrey podcast all the time. Tell your friends. All right. Love you. Take care. Bye.